It seems as though it takes a lifetime in order to find out really who you are as a person in the events of your life, the changes that take place, the things that are good and the things that are difficult seem to shape us in a knowledge of who we are. The same can be said of our relationship with God. How do we get to know Him, and how do we know how He feels about us? That again is a search. The particular parable told by Jesus is one that's familiar to us, but then on the other hand, we try to savor and find out what in fact is going on there and what the message is to you and to me. In that particular parable, he talks about someone who is a person who is religious. And when he does talk about that, he's talking about a group of people who, at the time in which the Romans came in, they became very aware of the gospel, the message of Moses, and they became very strict and very, very earnest in following that. And so what happened was, of course, that they were the people who were probably prized most in all of the country. And interestingly enough, if you look at it from the religious point of view, that's one way. But if you also see it as the identity of the people themselves, they were in the vanguard there as well. Because as good, faithful Jews, they were also communicating how to deal with the Romans being here, who have conquered us and who, in fact, are separating us in terms of how we see our country and ourselves. So there's a political and a religious kind of dimension to how they operated, and from that point of view, they became very convinced of being Jewish, even in the midst of the mess up of the Romans being there. And so that tells you about the first person who speaks. Interestingly enough, there is another person who speaks, and that person is the tax collector. Now, there couldn't be two people so different from one another, and therefore, what the whole story is about is understanding that. The tax collector is not the most popular person in our society either, but in reality, the people at the time who were tax collectors in Jesus' times were viewed in a very antagonistic way. And what I mean by that is that they were seen as people who in fact are traitors. They're collaborators with the Romans. And therefore, collecting taxes was seen as a treasonous kind of way of making a living, because they were collecting money from the Jewish people in order to obviously pay for the occupation of their country. And therefore, whatever was going to take place, the payment of the soldiers who were Romans, it had to do with the collection of taxes. So that's kind of two insults, if you think about it. One thing being conquered, but then on the other hand, you paying for being conquered, again, is something that is belittling and something that causes anger. And that's the way they felt towards this man. But in addition to that, being a tax collector was also about the fact that the only way you were going to rise in the corporate structure was that you befriended the Romans. And the Romans would say to the tax collector, you are to collect this amount of money. But in reality, if indeed the tax collector got this much money, guess where that extra came to? it was in the pockets of the tax collectors. So it was a way to become wealthy, powerful. And therefore, because it was on the back of your fellow citizens, you were deeply resented. And that's what's going on in terms of the Pharisees on the one hand and the tax collectors on the other. You'll notice both of them come to the temple. The temple is the center of religious life in the Jewish people then and today. And what happened was that this conversation that Jesus is talking about is taking place. And you'll notice that the Pharisee, he immediately says, God, I am so privileged to be over these people who are adulterers, these people who are sinners, these people who are liars, thieves. I am not like them. And then he goes on to say, I am not like this man here who is a tax collector, the bottom of the barrel in anyone's society, as far as we Jews are concerned. Then he says, every day, I pray. Every day, I give reverence to God. I give tithes for all my property, 10%, and so forth and so on he goes, until he finally says that he is pleased. You know, in the course of those simple words that he speaks, he has used the word I 5 times, which would give you the idea of where this guy is coming from. You see, he sees that he's what it's about. You know, he's not making a prayer to God, he's making a prayer to aggrandize himself. And so you see the self-centeredness, the self-absorption, the narcissism of this man. It's interesting, by comparison, you have this man over here who is a tax collector, and he's in the back of the temple, and he won't raise his eyes because he feels so diminished by the deeds of his life. And he says the one prayer that is so impactful. He says, "Forgive me, Lord, I am a sinner." And the tagline that finishes this particular gospel and this story is that Jesus says, and the one who asked for forgiveness left justified, while the other, the Pharisee, left simply acting upon himself. It's an interesting story because it does speak about human nature and about who we are. Namely, every last one of us fights the battle of our own self-absorption. And we also are people who make gigantic mistakes and come perhaps like this tax collector to realize the faults of our life and the amends that we wish to make. Now, really, the interesting part about this is, how do you get to that point of view? How do you understand that? How does God feel about you? And I guess that's where people are so given to having different interpretations. For example, the Pharisee is saying, I am righteous. I am righteous because I've done good things. I've lined up all these good things, and God can't refuse me. I'm going to have a straight path right up through the pearly gates because I've done it always right. Well, the whole story there is that it's not about what you do. It's what about God has done for you. And that's hard for us to understand because we look at life in sort of a commercial way. We look at life as if we're working someplace. If I'm there to be the earliest person on deck for the day, and if I leave as the latest person, then obviously I'm noticed by my boss. And he's going to, over time, lift me up in terms of giving me a promotion and a little bit more money. That's the way we see life. You do something, you get rewarded for it. But the interesting thing about dealing with God is that he doesn't need to be informed of your goodness. He knows it already. And what he has done for you is from birth said that you are mine. You will be with me because you have believed in me. So there's no way, or there's no need to try to feel as though you're going to beat God at his own game. He has said to you, you are saved already. And so you ask the question next, well, what is it to believe then? What is it to act upon and try to do good things? Well, the truth of the matter is that God accepts us, well, as we do our children, our grandchildren. Namely, we look upon them and see their lives, and we notice that, they're not the most beautiful, they're not the most intelligent, they're not the most achieving, but we love them. We love them without conditions, without them having to do anything. The first movement is that we love them. And therefore, forgiveness is rapid, reconciliation is quick, and our sense of closeness to God is irrevocable. That's the way it is between ourselves and God. He has looked upon us, given us life for a purpose, namely at the end of physical life to be joined to him. That is his disposition towards you and me. And that's important to understand. It's important to understand because many of the things that we fear are really things that we need peace about. And certainly about the value of our life and the goodness of it is precisely what Jesus is proclaiming in this particular parable. You are my people. You are the people I love. You are the people I call to myself. Frankly, if we believe that, we'd live more peaceful lives. We'd value ourselves a little bit more, and instead of condemning ourselves, we would know that God is always forgiving, always elevating us, and being a people of that kind of faith is what he calls us to.